So she now has a podcast and is also apparently friends with Meghan. And in the world premiere of podcast, Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, she pulled out all the stops. Here is the intro of.
There was a time when Meghan Markle could make headlines just by blinking. Every appearance, every gesture, every word became fodder for discussion. But when her team quietly sent out a pitch to Lemonada Media, a podcasting powerhouse known for authentic, raw storytelling, the silence that followed wasn't just deafening, it was defining. The proposal was straightforward. A new podcast, a new narrative, a new Meghan. She was ready to turn the page on Archetypes, the controversial podcast born from a multi-million-dollar Spotify deal that ended with more backlash than accolades. This time, her team promised things would be different. Meghan would be more real, more connected to the people, more honest. She was rebranding, again. But Lemonada didn't even blink. According to sources close to the deal, the pitch was dismissed before it even left the CEO's desk. Jessica Cordova Kramer, Lemonada's co-founder and a respected figure in the industry, personally rejected the proposal. There was no need for a second meeting, no request for revisions, not even a polite decline. The message was clear. We don't want this. Behind the scenes, the rationale was brutal in its honesty. The brand is toxic, said one insider. It's not about the numbers anymore. It's about what her name represents to listeners, and what it doesn't. Kramer, whose company has built its reputation on spotlighting real people with real struggles, from addiction and grief to survival and hope, wasn't interested in celebrity clickbait disguised as empathy. It wasn't always this way. In 2020, Spotify rolled out the red carpet for the Duchess of Sussex and her husband, Prince Harry. The announcement of their podcast deal was met with fanfare, a blend of royal glamour and American media enthusiasm. But Archetypes, though flashy at first, quickly faltered. Listeners complained the show was too scripted, too self-centered, and lacking in genuine connection. Instead of amplifying the voices of her guests, Meghan seemed more focused on crafting a perfect image of herself, poised, polished, and perpetually profound. One-star reviews poured in. Pretentious, self-indulgent, a PR stunt wrapped in fake empathy. Platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify were flooded with criticisms, and Meghan's podcast dropped from trending lists faster than it had appeared. The audience wasn't buying it, not the message and certainly not the messenger. So when her team approached Lemonada Media months later, they came not as trailblazers, but as salvage divers, hoping to rescue what was left of Meghan's credibility in the audio world. But Lemonada saw what Spotify had already learned. Good storytelling isn't built on buzzwords like empowerment and healing. It's built on trust. And Meghan, despite her titles and platform, had burned through too much of it. She came in with a high-gloss pitch, filled with vague promises and polished packaging, said one person familiar with the proposal. But it lacked substance. It was just another version of her own story, reframed for sympathy and brand rehab. In fact, according to insiders, Lemonada's internal response was almost instantaneous. Not a fit, one executive reportedly wrote. Not even close. To make matters worse, the team at Lemonada reportedly did their homework. They read the reviews. They studied the drop-off rates in podcast episodes. They listened to the critique, not from tabloids, but from long-time listeners, podcast professionals, and media critics. They understood that this wasn't just about whether Meghan could speak into a microphone. It was about whether the public still wanted to listen. And the answer, increasingly, was no. What hurt the most, say those familiar with Meghan's camp, wasn't just the rejection, but who it came from. Jessica Cordova Kramer wasn't some corporate gatekeeper obsessed with profit. She was a woman who had built her platform from the ground up, telling stories that mattered. For Meghan, who had long framed herself as a champion of women's voices, the irony was cutting. The very kind of platform she claimed to uplift had now become the one that turned her down. It wasn't personal, it was structural. Because while Meghan still had an audience, it wasn't the kind Lemonada was looking for. Increasingly, her name attracted listeners driven by curiosity, controversy, or even disdain. Hate listeners, as one producer crudely put it. the kind of metrics that drive engagement but kill credibility. To Lemonada, the risk was clear. Attach their trusted platform to a polarizing figure, and everything they'd built could crumble. One wrong partnership, one misstep, and they risked becoming the next headline, dragged into a swirl of drama, backlash, and brand erosion. So they passed. No announcement, no statement, just quiet rejection. And in the world of media, that silence speaks louder than any royal address. In the aftermath, Meghan's team tried to spin the rejection as scheduling conflicts and shifting focus, but insiders knew better. They understood that this wasn't just another door closed. It was a warning shot to every platform considering a collaboration. "She's not untouchable anymore," said one executive. "She's just not worth the noise." And so the Duchess of Sussex, once hailed as a modern voice for change, found herself in unfamiliar territory, ignored, uninvited, and worst of all, unneeded. The mic she once held with pride was slipping, and no one was reaching out to catch it. When Meghan Markle sat down for her first ever podcast interview, not as a host but as a guest, on the Jamie Kern-Lima show, it was clear she was aiming for something different. This wasn't a glossy Netflix special or a speech at a charity gala. It was intimate, feminine, emotional, the kind of setting where she could finally be seen. And she was, just not in the way she had hoped. The episode opened with soft lighting, a warm introduction, and carefully crafted praise. Jamie, a former news anchor turned cosmetics mogul, painted Meghan as a woman of substance, mother, entrepreneur, duchess, changemaker. The tone was reverent, almost worshipful. Meghan, in return, presented herself as exhausted but fulfilled. A woman juggling motherhood, business, podcast production, social media, product launches, and self-reflection. It was, on the surface, everything the public had said they wanted from her. But instead of admiration, the reaction was swift and skeptical. Viewers and listeners accused the Duchess of being performative. "Full-body chills," she said at one point, tearing up as she spoke about being seen by her children. It was the kind of line designed for viral sincerity, but many online saw only strategy. The heart of the problem wasn't that Meghan was emotional, it was that she seemed rehearsed. "Everything about that episode felt planned," said one listener in a viral post. "The pauses, the sighs, even the tears. It was too perfect, too clean. Real emotion isn't edited like that." The backlash wasn't confined to comment sections. On a rival podcast, a media analyst sneered. "She sounds like she's narrating a luxury skincare ad, not talking about life, or work, or struggle." Another critic joked, "She's not podcasting, she's branding with background music." And indeed, the branding was relentless. Meghan spoke of her new lifestyle company, American Riviera Orchard, and how its products sold out within the first hour. She detailed her daily tasks, writing captions, editing podcast notes, styling shoots, being a wife, a mother, a founder. But for many, it didn't land as inspiring. It came off as defensive, like someone trying to prove she worked harder than anyone dared believe. "She's trying to prove she's just like us," one commentator said. But it's hard to feel connected to someone editing photo shoots in a $14 million mansion in Montecito. That tension between wealth and relatability, image and intimacy, has become Meghan's defining paradox. She wants to be understood, yet controls every narrative. She craves authenticity, but her delivery feels filtered, wrapped in the language of empowerment, and bathed in self-importance. Even the small things, like referring to her husband as H and herself as M, felt contrived. "It was code," she explained, referencing the early days of their relationship. "No one knew we were dating." But the anecdote, meant to be charming, became a meme. "H and M," one user mocked. "Like the store, mass-produced, fast fashion branding." Perhaps the harshest responses came from within media circles. People who once championed Meghan for breaking royal molds now found themselves questioning her sincerity. "It's not that people don't want to root for her," said one editor at a progressive outlet. "It's that she keeps turning vulnerability into a performance." Jamie Kern-Lima, to her credit, tried to steer the conversation toward empowerment. But Meghan seemed fixated on image repair. The podcast, instead of becoming a breakthrough moment, turned into another exhibit in the court of public opinion, where every blink, every breath, every word is dissected for truth or manipulation. And yet, in all of this, Meghan continued to insist, "I love being that busy. I love working hard." It was meant as a statement of drive, of discipline, but it landed flat. Because here's the thing, when you've already been granted global access, royal privilege, and industry connections, hard work sounds different, especially to people struggling to pay rent, or mothers with 2 jobs and no childcare, or small business owners facing bankruptcy. It doesn't mean Meghan doesn't work hard. It means that no amount of curated effort can close the gap between her version of hard and the lived experience of her audience. In her attempt to be relatable, Meghan revealed just how far removed she had become. The vulnerability, the intimacy, the authenticity, it was all there. But it felt like a performance written for a focus group and delivered with a publicist's hand on the teleprompter. The result? Instead of healing her image, she deepened the divide. Instead of softening public perception, she confirmed it. And perhaps most painfully, instead of reminding the world that she still had a voice, it reminded them why they stopped listening. What Meghan Markle projects on camera is poise, elegance, and command. But behind the scenes, especially in the world of podcasting, insiders tell a different story. One marked not by grace, but by control, confusion, and creative chaos. The problems began during the production of her Spotify-backed podcast, Archetypes. Heralded as a groundbreaking exploration of female stereotypes, the show launched with royal flair and high expectations. The guests were A-list, the branding was immaculate, and the promotional budget was massive. But for those working behind the curtain, the experience was anything but inspiring. "She micromanaged everything," said one former producer, requesting anonymity. Every script, every interview edit, every intro and outro, it all had to be rewritten to position Meghan as the center of wisdom. Even guest quotes were carefully selected to frame her as the insightful one. Another production staffer described the process as suffocating. Scripts were finalized, then scrapped. Editorial decisions were debated endlessly. Producers were told to tone it down, then make it stronger, then bring it back to Meghan. It wasn't collaboration, it was compliance. This obsessive control wasn't just exhausting, it was counterproductive. According to internal Spotify metrics leaked by industry sources, listen-through rates dropped dramatically after the first episode. Many blamed the polished, rehearsed feel of the show. Instead of a meaningful conversation, listeners felt they were being pulled into a PR monologue, carefully sanitized, stripped of spontaneity, and edited to perfection. Even the structure of the podcast suffered. Segments that should have flowed organically were broken by inserted narration. Meghan's reflections were peppered throughout, regardless of whether they advanced the conversation or simply reinforced her narrative. Everything had to come back to her, the producer added, even when the guest was the one with the real story. What should have been a space to amplify others became a stage to recast Meghan's image. It didn't help that production costs spiraled as rewrites piled up and edits dragged on. Deadlines were missed, morale plummeted, and worse, word got around. Spotify executives, once eager to showcase Meghan as a marquee talent, began to grow distant. She wanted to be Oprah, but treated her team like interns, another insider quipped. It wasn't sustainable. This reputation, unfortunately for Meghan, didn't stay confined to Spotify. When her team later approached Lemonada Media with a new pitch, Jessica Cordova Kramer didn't just look at the proposal, she looked at the track record. She'd heard the whispers. She'd read the reviews. She understood that working with Meghan wasn't just about producing a good show. It meant navigating a minefield of expectations, edits, and egos. Edits? It was, as one executive put it bluntly, unworkable. For an industry built on trust, vulnerability, and creative flow, Meghan represented the opposite. A name that sparked red flags in editorial meetings. A project that looked shiny but came with stress. A brand so obsessed with control that the end product lost its soul. And herein lies the irony. The podcast world, especially platforms like Lemonada, succeeds not because of polish, but because of imperfection. Listeners crave human voices, raw emotions, unfinished thoughts. They want mess. They want mistakes. They want people who say, "I don't know," and mean it. But Meghan's version of storytelling left no room for that. Everything was choreographed, every word massaged, every silence calculated. She wanted vulnerability, but only on her terms. She wanted chaos, but only the kind she could edit out. And the industry noticed. "She doesn't understand what makes audio work," one veteran producer said. "She thinks storytelling is about being admired. It's not. It's about being understood." The fallout from archetypes didn't just damage her relationship with Spotify. It sent a ripple effect through the podcasting world. Other platforms, once interested in courting royal talent, began to reconsider. Was it worth the hassle? Was it worth the control battles, the branding interference, the headlines? Increasingly, the answer was no. That's why Lemonada didn't hesitate. Not because Meghan wasn't talented, not because she lacked a story, but because the podcasting world had already lived through the storm and decided it didn't want to weather another. In the end, it wasn't the press, the tabloids, or the Twitter trolls that closed the door. It was her own team's inability to let go of the script. Once upon a time, Meghan Markle was hailed as a media force, a woman of mixed heritage breaking into a historically closed royal family. An actress turned duchess turned activist, a voice for feminism, for mental health, for modern motherhood. Her star was bright, and for a while it felt unstoppable. But in the world of media, where perception is everything and goodwill is a currency, stars can burn out fast. After archetypes fizzled and the Spotify deal dissolved with quiet embarrassment, Meghan's team began the long, desperate journey of revival. The Lemonada proposal was only one of many efforts to rebuild her brand. Efforts that included lifestyle products, social campaigns, and high-profile interviews. But each comeback attempt landed with less impact, less enthusiasm, and more scrutiny. Netflix, which once bet big on the Sussexes, quietly pulled back. The documentary that was meant to redefine them was met with lukewarm reception. Projects promised in early press releases disappeared. American Riviera Orchard, a brand that launched with curated Instagram aesthetics and luxury appeal, was mocked online for its vague purpose and out-of-touch packaging. And now, Lemonada had slammed the door. It was no longer about one failed podcast or one public backlash. It was a pattern. A brand built on high-concept identity, but lacking in emotional resonance. Meghan was no longer a blank canvas onto which people could project hope or possibility. She had become, to many, a mirror of everything performative, overly curated, and insincere in modern celebrity. What once looked like vulnerability now felt like manipulation. What was once framed as empowerment now resembled entitlement, and what once passed as authentic had been filtered so heavily that even her supporters began to step back. Even traditionally liberal media outlets that had once defended her were quietly shifting. Profiles softened, coverage cooled. Op-eds that once hailed her as a symbol of progress now described her as misguided, detached, and calculated. The tone changed, and she could feel it. "She's not the media darling anymore," said one editor at a major publication. "She's a cautionary tale." At the center of it all, one truth became hard to ignore. Meghan Markle didn't just lose the spotlight. She lost the trust of platforms, producers, and perhaps most crucially, the public. Her desire to control the narrative had ultimately made her lose it. That's what Lemonada's rejection truly represented. Not just a failed pitch, but a cultural verdict. She was no longer seen as a storyteller. She was the story, one that the media had read too many times, and in an age where attention is everything, Meghan Markle was no longer someone people were curious to hear from. She was someone people were tired of deciphering. And the woman once poised to redefine royal relevance and female empowerment in the digital era found herself staring at a closed door and a silent mic. No pitch, no platform, no applause, only the echo of a voice that once captivated the world, now struggling to be heard.